Well, here we are. Well done, everybody, for making it this far. Welcome back. Just before I introduce the next speaker, oh, hang on a second, I've just remembered, I've forgotten to do something. Live time, there we go, done it. I've got to switch the Slido presentations over. Sorry about that. We've got a Slido link coming up that's going to ask you a question. It's the same link. If you were contributing during Brewing Ideas, it's the same link. It's going to come on screen now. It's that link there. And we're asking you the question, what do we mean by co-creation? We're not going to share these live at the end of the Congress. It's just a way of us collating some thoughts from you, which we can then share post-Congress. So once we leave it up there for a couple of minutes while I introduce our next speaker, then that'll disappear and you'll hear no more about it until the end of the when we do the Congress wrap-up emails with some thoughts that you've generated. So now on to our final keynote. I saw this speaker at the Theatres Trust Conference in London last year, and then also at the Greater Manchester Arts Sustainability Summit earlier this year. His passion for the importance of storytelling and in the context of what Ronnie Panoy was saying this week in this space, restorying, Rob was seen by the programming committee as a great way to end the conference. So, could you please join me in welcoming to the stage Rob Hopkins.
Hello, hello, lovely to see you all. I'm your last speaker, and I always hate it when I go to a conference and you've been on a 4 or 5 day amazing shared journey together, and then the last speaker hasn't been through any of it at all. And so I apologise for that. But I was yesterday in Pembrokeshire, and I went to see puffins for real. So I hope some of that awe and delight will kind of is something I can pass on. And if nothing else, I can at least tell you that the word for baby puffins is that they're called pufflings, which I didn't know before, which quite made my day. So I'm Rob, and I'm here to talk about longing. Because I think it's something really, really, really important in the work that we do. And I want to just start by showing you this. You've had a long 3 or 4 days. You don't need very many graphs. I'm only going to show you this one. But I just want to make the point, really, that the climate and ecological emergency that we're in now is something which has a context. So ever since humanity first emerged and started agriculture and then building pyramids, and everything that we associate with human civilization and history and culture emerged in this very stable band of climate where carbon dioxide never went above 280 parts per million, and we was very, very stable. Now we have burst completely out of that into a whole new sort of atmosphere, I guess. And we're already at 1.2 degrees. We see terrible things happening around the world, even at that relatively small increase. And at the moment, we're on target for about a 3 to 4 degree rise in global temperatures. The French Environment Minister recently published a report that was about how France can adapt to a 4-degree world. I have news for you, France can't adapt to a 4-degree world. France can barely even adapt to a 1.2 degree world. And so managing, doing everything we can to keep the climate emergency from accelerating is the most fundamentally important thing. And this is something created by David Holmgren, who's the co-originator of the idea of permaculture, where he says the stories that we tell about where we go from here are really, really important. And the first one he calls techno-explosion, that kind of Elon Musk sort of, well, we'll all just go and live on Mars then. I never saw the appeal myself of living in a place with no trees. And we either have that, or we have this idea of techno-stability, that we can just run a green, growth-based consumer society, but we'll just have electric cars instead, and we'll run everything on solar panels and wind, which creates a new kind of race for resources, a new kind of resource colonialism, which feeds the kind of struggles and the kind of injustice that we heard about so powerfully in the previous session. The third one is collapse, which, as we heard in the previous session, is already happening in a number of parts of the world. But actually, this idea that everything will just spectacularly fall apart. My work has always been underpinned by this fourth one, the idea that actually the global north, as the key driver of this crisis around the world, needs to fundamentally rethink its expectations, the stories that it tells about itself, the stories it tells about the future that it wants to be ahead of itself, and that it needs to redesign so that we use less and less energy, but use that as the opportunity to create a much better world, a much fairer, more equal, a world that delights in its diversity, a very different kind of an economic model, a kind of degrowth economic model. We will only do that if the stories that we tell where we are now on the top of this mountain, the stories we tell about the bottom of that slope are so delicious and so exciting and so glorious that we wake up every morning thinking, that's what we want to do. Don DeLillo, in his book Underworld, said, longing on a large scale is what makes history. Longing on a large scale is what makes history. And I think often as climate activists we forget and we think we can just talk about collapse and extinction and that that's going to mobilize people to the kind of change that we need. It doesn't work like that. The Institute for the Future in the US have this written on their window. They say, any useful statement about the future should at first seem ridiculous. Usually when I give talks, I always say to people, so I'm here to urge you, please, to all be as ridiculous as you can possibly be. But I think you're all much better at this than most of my audiences would be. In my town, we had a local currency scheme for about 11 years, and we had a £21 note. Because people would say, why do you have a £21 note? And we could say, why not? We can do whatever we like. And actually, it's inspired many other places, like I've just dropped one there. So this is a local currency from Avignon in France. It's called La Roue. They have a 13 note. And in Liège in France, they have a 0 note. Yeah, and then when you say, well, why do you have a 0 note? They would say, well, you know, sometimes somebody does something nice for you and you don't want to pay, you want to say thank you, but you don't want to put a number on it. It seems a bit mercenary. So like a little token of kind of gratitude. So I think we need to be, because we've left the climate emergency so late, that the idea that we can just move in small little incremental steps is about 30 years behind us now. The ideas need to be big and bold and audacious, and that requires us to actually, if someone says, what a ridiculous idea, is that we say, oh, thank you very much. We kind of wear that like as a badge of honor. I gave a talk recently at a conference in Switzerland of 400 young people involved in organic food and farming. And the speaker before me was from a big supermarket chain. And 5 times in his talk he said, and I urge you to be pragmatic. When it came to me, I said, please don't be pragmatic. The last thing we need is you to be pragmatic. Please, I really urge you to be as ridiculous as you can. This is a picture from the late 1960s in the US. When people went to the beach, everybody just parked their cars on the beach. So when you went to the beach, that's what it looked like. So shortly after this picture was taken, something changed because it doesn't look like that anymore. And I think we can all agree it's much nicer now to go to the beach and it not be completely covered in cars. But you can guarantee there will have been people then who said, but I can't imagine going to the beach and not parking my car on the beach. The fact that people can't imagine something is no reason why we shouldn't do it. I think we're facing a crisis where it could be, where we have a collective failure of the imagination, a collective poverty of the imagination at the very time when we need to fundamentally reimagine everything. And I think that's really, really dangerous. And recently, the United Nations wrote a report where they said any chance of staying below 1.5 degrees is now finished unless we see a rapid transformation of society. And so every newspaper article, every magazine cover ran with headlines like this: 1.5 is finished, say goodbye to 1.5. I didn't see a single one that said, let's do that rapid transformation of society thing. Wouldn't that be better? Wouldn't that be kind of preferable? Let's have a rapid transformation of society. It's not like it's working amazingly well at the moment as it is. But as a species, we just leap from, oh, it's not a problem, to, oh, well, it's too late. It's like you wake up in the night, you smell smoke, and you just ring your insurance company. It doesn't work like that. You do something about it in the middle. So a lot of my work at the moment is inspired by this T-shirt that this young woman was wearing at the Black Lives Matter protest in Washington in 2020. I've been to the future. We won. It gave me goosebumps when I saw it. I thought it was so fabulous. And how different our activism would be if it was underpinned by that way of thinking. And this is one of my great sheroes, a woman called Rashida Phillips from Pittsburgh in the US. and she runs something called, so by day, she's a bit like a superhero. Like by day, she works in a neighborhood that's being gentrified, and she works as a housing lawyer working with communities of color to protect their housing. And by night, she runs this thing called Black Quantum Futurism, which is all about time travel as a kind of radical political tool. So she does all these incredible events, and one of them, she doesn't gather people's oral histories, she gathers people's oral futures. And she talks about time travel in a really interesting way. She said this is a scan out of a very small book, so I apologize for how grainy it is. She said, in the West, the notion of time, it's like a line. We go from past to present to future, and we talk about the future like it's we kind of know what it's going to be. She said, actually, in kind of traditional African ways of looking at it, or in Afrofuturist ideas, it's this idea of it more being like a wheel and we're in the middle, and from there you can access many different futures and many different pasts as well. And I feel like those of us who work in the space of climate and social justice and trying to make change need to become much better at that, about accessing different kinds of futures. So the exciting news I have to share with you today, we've traveled up from the southwest, from a small town called Totnes, and what you might not know about our small town is that we have the world's first successful time machine construction project. Ooh. Thank you. I think that definitely deserved an ooh. And in our place, we have built successfully a time machine, and together with my with Kit, my colleague here, we travel into the near future. We travel to 2030, and the 2030 that we travel to is not a utopia, and it's not a dystopia, but it's the 2030 that resulted from us doing absolutely everything we could possibly have done. So those 7 years between now and then were the most exhilarating time to be alive. It felt like we lived through a kind of revolution of the imagination where anything felt possible. It was the most extraordinary of times. And what I want to do is to tell you a story about a recent trip that we took there. So you might like to think of me as the kind of Marco Polo of the climate movement, a sort of somebody to tell you some tales of visiting the future and how it was. So we set up our time machine here in this street, pretty normal kind of street, and set the dial for 2030. And then when we stepped out of it, it looked like this. The air smelled so much better. There was a collective sense of people working together to achieve something. I showed you in the picture before, we had to wear our special kind of protective costume. That's not to protect us, that's to protect the people in the future from us bringing our kind of 2023 cynicism and despondency. And we're not allowed to sort of pollute that future. And part of the training to be able to time travel is that you have to learn to not do any past-splaining. So you're not allowed to turn up and say, yeah, that's never going to work. Because by then, people have got this fragile but just possible sense of, do you know what? I think we might just do this, actually. Birdsong was so much louder. And my friends, I have to tell you, the bicycle rush hours of 2030 are an absolute joy to behold. Manchester, every day, tens of thousands of bicycles pouring through the center of the city. And back in 2023, you might remember, you would get these signs that would tell you about the car parking spaces and how many spaces there were. By 2030, those were all for bicycles. For some reason, they're all written in Dutch. I think something slightly traumatic happened in Manchester in about 2026 that nobody wanted to talk to me about. But hey, something to look forward to. And now all the underground car parks that we don't need anymore because there's so few cars, we had to find alternative uses for those. So they're now these amazing, safe, clean, bright places where you can leave your bicycle. And cycling has become just the sort of the normal thing for people who are able to do that, and for people who aren't, there's things in place to enable that, enable people to get around. But it was a kind of, what we realized back in 2023 was that for every €1 million that we spent on building cycling infrastructure, we saved €38 million off the National Health Bill. So the way that we looked at how we spent money fundamentally changed. We were investing in the future. Another thing that happened was that in 2024, again, the worst of the banks collapsed. And this time, Unlike in 2008 where we bailed them out, this time we didn't, and we brought them into national ownership to use their resources and their infrastructure to drive a very different kind of a future. And what that meant was that there was a real shift that we noticed walking about in ownership. People, communities owned a lot more things: building, land, enterprises, energy, infrastructure. This was an old bank which has now been repurposed and home to many different enterprises. And on the roof they had co-housing, 300 people living here. They grow food on the roof and they even had their own little forest there. So there was this big shift in ownership. Development has become something communities do rather than something that gets done to us by developers. Another thing that was beautiful was to see how there had been a real shift. Now when you walk around Manchester city centre, you don't see endless buildings being built using concrete, because we realised that in 2023 that 9% of all carbon emissions were caused by cement production and concrete. And so now we build in a very different way. So now this is a place we went to visit where they're building social apartments using timber from the region, structural timber from the region, using straw bales in the wall, using clay plasters. So you're building beautiful, energy efficient, ecological buildings, very healthy to live in, creating a whole new economy. The whole economic model changed. So the aim is to keep money circulating locally, something that was trialed in Preston back in the early 2020s, became the model for how we do everything now. People even make bicycles out of local wood. It's just how it works. Visited many places where communities are closing their streets to cars, taking that space back. And in this place here, people were very happy to show us what it looked like back in 2023. Now looks like this, because the community got together and pushed for that and made that happen. And in order to do that, this was something we saw everywhere. Because in those hot summers of 2022 and 2023, it became very, very clear that concrete and tarmac, when we get above 32, 33 degrees in urban spaces, concrete and tarmac kill people. And so cities are feeling much softer. One of the biggest growth areas now in cities is getting rid of concrete and tarmac and replacing it with space that can breathe, for more biodiversity, more ability to absorb water. So here in 2030, when we look back to 2023, where could we see the beginnings of this? What were people doing in 2023 that meant that we were able to do this? One thing was we had artists who were brilliant at creating images of the future. They started to cultivate longing. The poet Rilke once said, "The future must enter into you a long time before it happens." And that began to underpin our activism and what happened. So this was James Mackay from the University of Leeds who drew the future. He said, what if our cities became the most biodiverse places they could possibly be? What if we took bicycles out of our cities? What would we do with that space? 2/3 of the surface area of Los Angeles is dedicated to cars. That's a lot of space. What else could we do with that space? Our children could walk to school through streets like this, through gardens like this. Activism as well became much more around this idea of bringing the future into the present. This was back in 2019, if any of you can remember back that far, when Extinction Rebellion, in the first big rebellion, where Extinction Rebellion closed Waterloo Bridge for 2 weeks and turned it into a forest, put trees all down the middle. And I've met a few people now who crossed that bridge every day to go to work, who told me how they stopped on that bridge and went, oh, why can't it always be like this? And who then gave up their jobs and now work in climate change and in sustainability stuff. So I like to think of this as being a pop-up tomorrow. What they did was they took the future that we long for, the future that we have to create, and they created a pop-up version of it that people could interact with and see what it smelt like and tasted like, and that actually it's not so scary after all. This was amazing. I was in Bath last week to visit the Forest of Imagination, where they took over the assembly rooms in Bath and turned it into the Forest of Imagination. Incredible space with turned it into grasslands and with like a wood henge. They had massive beaver, what they call lodge. So I think this idea of taking places that already exist and turning them into how we want the future to be is something we need to do an awful lot more of. So meanwhile, back in 2030, we went to visit a neighborhood, which is now how it's done all around the world, but neighborhoods that are designed where there is no space for cars. The cars are designed out of the space. And walking around here, you could hear children playing. You could so many bicycles, beautiful place with big trees and very ecological buildings. There is a car in that picture I'm noticing there. I think they just keep that as a sort of memento of the past. And they grow courgettes in it. It grows very, very good courgettes. They can sort of wheel it around. So I mentioned that one of the reasons that we go to 2030 is to make recordings. So part of my work is this idea that if you could time travel to 2030 and you could record what it sounded like and you could bring those recordings back to people in 2023 and play them to people, how would that change their sense of longing, their sense of possibility? So I'm going to share with you now a little 1-minute recording, an actual recording from 2030. Thank you. Yes, so you might like to close your eyes and put your feet on the ground and imagine that you're stepping out from this theatre into the Manchester of 2030 of public transport, streets filled with children playing, a bird song and bicycles. So we do a lot of traveling to that 2030 and bring back a lot of those kind of recordings inspired by Bell Hooks, who said, what we cannot imagine cannot come into being. One of the things in many cities now, as I mentioned, the underground car parks, we don't really need them so much anymore. So a lot of them are now being repurposed to grow mushrooms as well, for food, for medicines, for protein, for substitutes, for leather, even construction materials. Some cities are now starting to build mushroom-based homes. And this was an incredible place that we went to visit, which is a school, where the kids in the school had been asked to design their own school. Turns out that when children sit down with an architect and design their own school, they design something quite different from what schools looked like back in 2023. And when you ask kids to design their own school, one of the things that comes out again and again is they say, we'd like it to have a rainforest in the middle. The education system has really, really changed by 2030. It's much more now. Everything is taught through the lens of the climate and ecological emergency. Kids are taught to be much more imaginative, much more creative. They're kind of supported to become the learners that they need to be, rather than just shepherded from one thing to another. And schools themselves are really living, breathing examples of how that future could be, and the buildings that it happens in really, really help. Agriculture really changed as well. The landscape around in rural areas has much changed because we realized after those very dry summers of 2022, 2023, that agriculture couldn't just keep on assuming that it would always have access to the water that it just felt was its birthright, that it needed to actually change what it did. So we saw a lot more integration of trees into agriculture, a lot more keeping of ground covered. So our diet has shifted, much more diversity in terms of plants and the things that we eat. Beautiful. And so the biodiversity has started to rebound as a result of that. And one of the things I loved was that by 2030, we had developed the humility to recognize that beavers are much better hydrological engineers than human beings. I'm always so in awe of people who do sign language. I'd love to know how you do beaver in sign language. Okay. I was hoping there might be something like that. So this is a place that we went to visit which had been rewilded by beavers. Absolutely incredible. The biodiversity had just exploded here. When you sat by these ponds, all you could hear was fish jumping in and out of the water because the fish are so much bigger than they were. There's so much more insects and bats and birds. And now we don't see flooding anymore because everywhere where there was floods above from there, we just handed over to the beavers and just let them get on with it. And democracy fundamentally shifted. We now use citizens' assemblies at the national scale, the local scale, the regional scale for big decisions. So people are now making decisions collectively on behalf of their peers rather than on their own ideas. And many, many cities are now have what's called a civic imagination office, which started in Bologna in Italy in 2012. It was the first civic imagination office where they noticed a real decline of people being involved in democracy. And so they started these 6 laboratories around the city, and in each one they would run big visioning exercises like this. And then the smart bit was that when the municipality then would sit with the people and say, great idea, let's make that happen. We can offer this and this and this, you can offer that, good, let's make a pact. And they made something like 500 pacts between the people and the citizens in Bologna over just a few years. This model is now everywhere because we recognize that to make the changes on the scale and the urgency that we have to, we need to create space for reimagining. The imagination needs space. And if we don't create it, it'll never happen. Every organization will just continue doing whatever it did before unless you make that space. At the moment, Camden Council in London are running the first imagination activist training with its staff to create a group of people within that organization who are the imagination activists, the one who are asking the what-if questions, the ones who aren't afraid to be ridiculous, the ones who keep opening up that space. And it's something that we all became much, much better at by 2030. Universities have fundamentally shifted now. Every university degree is taught through the lens of the climate and ecological emergency. This place we went to visit, there's no lawn left anymore around it. It's all food growing. The students there are involved in growing food. And every time the university needs a new building, the students build the building and they learn the hands-on practical skills through doing that as well. In this building here, they used 1,500 old car tires that would otherwise have been thrown away, locally produced hemp and lime and clay and timber to produce a beautiful ecological building, but a building that everybody had been involved in and learned so much from being part of it. And a thing that was gorgeous that we saw in this place here was a change in how the food system worked. So in this town, back in 2020, the municipality had bought this piece of land, and they had created on that piece of land a food garden to grow food for the local schools. They grow 80% of all of the food eaten in the local schools in this garden here. And it was an absolutely beautiful thing to see, because what hadn't been anticipated was that the culture change that would accompany it. So now 60% of families with kids in the school shop differently, prepare food differently because of the culture shift that was triggered by the school taking that big step. So by 2026, Sodexo and those other big sort of companies who provided school meals all went out of business a year after BP and Shell went out of business, by the way. Good riddance. And so it was a fantastic thing. And this model now has spread absolutely everywhere. So every city, every town has built this kind of network to supply its systems. The kids go out and learn to grow the food. They're involved in cooking the food in the school. It was also the first town I ever went to that had a goth mayor. It's amazing. It looked like he was out of Green Day or something, had great hair and very tight trousers. And this model that started in Liège, in Belgium back in 2014, the Liège food belt, turned out to have been an idea that was seismically important. People back in 2023 used to say, oh, well, communities, stuff that communities can do, it's small and it's kind of irrelevant. And, actually only big change only ever really starts with governments doing things. Nonsense. Actually, when communities and local organizations come together to create something with that kind of boldness and vision to it, it can spread and it can be deeply transformative. In 2014, again, if any of you can remember back that far, I went to Liège. And in Liège, the transition group there had come up with a question. They said, what if in a generation's time, the majority of food eaten in Liège came from the land closest to Liège? They called it the Liège food belt, the ceinture alimentaire. I went back in 2018. By then, they'd already started 27 new cooperatives and raised €5 million of investment from the people of the city buying shares in those cooperatives. I met the guy who'd raised €2.5 million to start a cooperative vineyard. And I said, how did you do that? Like, what made you think, oh yeah, that'll work? And he looked at me a little bit puzzled and he said, it's Belgium. People like wine. People have some money. Don't be afraid. So I always pass that advice on to people. He said we had a good story. We had a great story. And a good story and a good what-if question makes people really curious. And curious to the extent that they really, really want that thing to happen. And they'll get involved and they'll make it happen. So by 2023 already, this is now the model that the municipality is using, working with the community to rethink how its schools, its universities, and its hospitals procure their food. It's now spread to 6 other cities in Belgium. And by 2030, this has become the new normal. This is what everywhere does, because the economic benefits to the place, the health benefits, the biodiversity benefits are just off the scale. And actually, back in 2022, the mayor of Liège made me an honorary citizen of Liège. He said, everybody thought Liège was a bit crap, really, until this started. And now you go all over the world and you tell everyone how great Liège is. You're like a kind of an ambassador of Liège. And I said, well, that's very nice. And he gave me a kind of a medal. And I said, thanks very much. Could I have my European citizenship back as well, please? He said, oh, Mr. Hopkins, that is not within my power, I'm afraid. So. The other thing that we saw everywhere was, but by now, all of our energy comes from renewables, but we consume a lot less energy. So it's not like it's everywhere is completely covered, but we've cut our demand a lot. But now, of the renewable energy infrastructure that we see, more than half of that is in community ownership. So back in 2023, you had pioneers like Bristol Community Energy, Bath and West Community Energy, who were raising millions of pounds of investment from local people to put in place renewable energy. The infrastructure changed and allowed that to just explode. 2024, 2025, 2026, the great years of community energy where people moved money from the banks into community energy around where they lived. So again, energy became something that we did rather than something that was done to us by massive distant companies. So, to bring us back to 2023, all of the things that I've shared with you here already exist. William Gibson, the science fiction writer, said the future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed. So all those things already exist. We started in a street in Amsterdam. The city with the bicycle rush hours is Utrecht in Holland. The bank building repurposed is in Switzerland. I didn't take you to that place. The building that is in Grenoble, the school designed by children is in Madrid, the street closed is in Lausanne in Switzerland. The place I played you the recording from is from the Vauban in Freiburg, incredible. If you ever feel like you're losing hope about what a low carbon future, more local future would look like, go to the Vauban in Freiburg. The mushrooms being grown in Paris, the mayor of Paris, recently, because the underground car parks aren't being used hardly at all in Paris now because there are so many less cars. So she ran a competition for alternative uses for them, and now they're filling up with mushroom growers and people storing wine and people growing salads. The agriculture project is in south of France. I told you about Bologna. That's the University of Liège, where they're growing food everywhere. In Luxembourg, where they're building the new building. The town where they're growing the food for the schools is called Montsartou. It's near Nice. And I talked about Liège. So we aren't waiting for someone to invent some kind of magic silver bullet, some amazing app that's going to solve everything. Everything we need to know already exists. We know how to do everything. What we're lacking is the stories, and what we're lacking is the longing, is that deep, deep hunger to make that a reality. So what I do with this stuff is that I go to places that already exist, and I make recordings of what that sounds like, and then I'm working with Kit, who's the most amazing ambient electronic music artist, and we make these tracks, we call them field recordings from the future. And my brief to him was that they should cultivate a nostalgia for the future. How do we use music? How do we use theatre? How do we use performance, improv, all of those things to cultivate that kind of nostalgia for the future? And then we're also working on a comic book about us traveling to 2030 and what that's like. So I just want to finish off with a little story, if I may. And I wrote a book called From What Is to What If, which was about imagination and about the decline of our collective imagination at the worst possible time in history for that to be the case. I feel like we're living in a time where there's a perfect storm of factors that are deeply undermining our imagination. And one of the things that I learned when I was doing that was about the part of your brain called the hippocampus. Hippocampus is where your imagination and your memory both fire from, and it's the part of your brain that is most vulnerable to cortisol. So when we are anxious or stressed or in trauma, it can shrink by up to 20%. And what the research says is that when that happens, that's when we lose perspective of the future, and we just get stuck in the present and we get stuck in the past. And it feels like we have created a sort of a cortisol economy, a kind of cortisol culture at the worst possible time when our systems are awash with cortisol and the future is sort of disappearing when we need it to come really very clearly into focus. So I wanted to try and find a place where they were setting out intentionally to rebuild the hippocampus. What does that look like? How would you do that? So I went to a place in Dundee in Scotland called Archangel, which is on the first floor of an office block in the middle of Dundee, run by this amazing woman called Rosalie Somerton and an amazing team of people, all of whom who've had experience of the mental health system as part of one of the requirements of working there. And they say, when you come here, you're not a patient, you're not a client, you're an artist, and you're preparing work for an exhibition. And every year in the biggest gallery in Dundee, they put on an exhibition of work from the artists at Archangel. And everybody who was there knew I was coming, and they were all really happy to share their stories. I spoke to one guy who'd worked in local government for about 30 years, and then he'd had a sort of a big breakdown and loss of self-esteem, and he was doing this painting with all of these dots, different colors. And I said, so do you think of yourself as an artist? And he paused, and he said, why not? You know, you could see people kind of reimagining who they were. I spoke to a young woman who said, I have 2 beautiful children, a partner who I really, really love, and 6 months ago I came back close to taking my own life. And since I've been coming here, now I can see the future again. I want to do this. I want to go to college. I want to do art. I want to do whatever. So when I spoke to Rosalie and I said, what are you doing here? Why does this work? She said, because we create a space of safety and a space of hope, which sounded like what a lot of the people who were speaking on the panel earlier were talking to as well in the work that you do. And when I was there, I asked her, well, how do you kind of evaluate what you're doing? And she said, well, every year we don't give our artists like a multiple choice sort of tick box form thing. We give them a piece of paper with 2 outlines of a human body, and we say, fill the first one to show how you felt before you came here, and the second one to show how you feel now you've been coming here for some time. And I looked through a big pile of these. It was very, very moving. I just want to share one with you that really, really touched me. So when I look at that, for me, I feel like that's what it feels like when our hippocampus starts to grow back again. It's what it feels like when we connect with that kind of imaginative part of ourselves. It's also, if we listen to what the climate scientists are telling us right now that we need to be doing and not asking us, they're kind of pleading with us and supergluing themselves to the doors of Chase Bank in New York, demanding that we act on what they're talking about, which is way beyond this sort of government net zero by 2050 nonsense, which is a political target, not a scientific target. What would it feel like if we actually did all of that stuff? If by 2030 we were a truly low carbon economy and we had made that shift and harnessed all of the creativity and brilliance and imagination and possibility that enabled us to do that, what would it feel like to live through that kind of revolution of the imagination? I think it would feel like this. So people in the last round were asked, well, you know, what gets you out of bed every morning? This is really the picture that gets me out of bed every morning. So I'm nearly at time. I just wanted to finish with a quote which I'm sure some of you will know. It's always a good idea, isn't it, when you do this, to put a page in, a little sort of bookmark, so you can find it really easily. So it's by Antoine Saint-Exupéry, who wrote The Little Prince. He said, if you want to build a ship, don't drum up people, I can't even read my own writing, don't drum up people to collect wood and don't assign them tasks and work, but rather teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you. I think there's a couple of minutes left. Does that mean I can do questions for 2 minutes? Oh, how exciting. I didn't know there was going to be time for questions. Any question or reflection or anything? Yes? Can everybody hear? Can I?
Spent a lot of time. Should I repeat any of that?
You all heard the question? No,
All
okay.
right, very quickly. Indigenous knowledge, very important to climate justice movement. I read a statistic that 80% of the world's biodiversity is still stewarded in the hands of indigenous people. So there is so much knowledge there that is still relevant today that scientists are learning from. And I'm curious where in your work this might have come up, because clearly you've spent so much time and investment. I'm so excited by your work, just to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I feel like at the moment that most of the work that inspires me the most around imagination and how to create it and why it's important is coming from usually women activists of color and indigenous people like Rashida Phillips and Adrienne Marie Brown and Walida Imarisha and Mariame Kaba, people like that, and from indigenous activists too. So on the podcast that I do, we get quite a few people bringing those voices and really trying to make a space for that. Yeah, I mean, I think there's what we always, when we were trying to design the transition movement, which is now about 16, 17 years old, and you can find transition groups in 50 different countries around the world. And the idea was very much, how do we move the global north down off that plateau? Because it's the global north that is really driving and responsible for this, and its expectations that it exports all around the world, and then the structures it puts in place to kind of protect that way of doing things. And so it's the global north that needs to shift. So what we were it's explicitly designing something that was like a detox for the kind of affluent global north to change what it's doing. And so what's been really fascinating has been, because also, within indigenous movements, there's already things like transition that come from those movements, Via Campesina, Buen Vivir, these kind of movements that come from a place and that are about alternatives to development rather than alternative models of development. So, but it's then fascinating to see that in many places in South America, for example, there are transition groups who are working often alongside and in support and in solidarity with indigenous groups there. So I think those relationships and are really vital, yeah. Thank you. I'm flashing red over here, so I will hand on to the next thing. And again, thank you so much.
So thank you, Rob, you truly delivered there. Thank you, that's brilliant. During the Congress, we've talked about the next generation, and it's a topic that has peppered many of the conversations throughout the week. When we were planning the Congress, we decided in the true spirit of co-creation to make sure some early career artists and leaders were in the Congress to participate and hear and reflect. So two of those colleagues, early career colleagues, are here to share with us some reflections on what they've heard this week. So please welcome to the stage James Varney and Clodagh Chapman.
Hello, good afternoon. Nice to see you all from this side. I'm James Varney. I'm an artist based here in Manchester. I'm 6'2" man, which is about 188 centimeters, I'm told. I have got long, curly blonde hair, and I'm wearing a grey shirt and blue jeans.
I am Clodagh Chapman. I am also an artist in Manchester. I am a 5-foot, bang-on woman, so that's 152 centimetres. I have short brown hair. I am wearing an orange shirt and blue jeans. And my pronouns are she, her.
Yeah, and we're here representing a group of young artists based in Manchester who have been attending the conference, the Congress, and we are sharing some reflections from the week. And I'd like to start with talking about an idea. I went to a writing workshop which was run by a playwright called Kimber Lee, whose play, Untitled Fuck Miss Saigon play, is currently on at the Royal Exchange as part of Manchester's International Festival. And one of the exercises that she ran with us was asking us to think about plays, the way that we write plays, and to think about the terminology that we use and define it from first principles. So ask ourselves the questions, what is a play? What is a character? What is an audience? What is a scene? And work from the ground up to reach definitions that we could share with each other to make sure that we were of equal understanding when we were using those words in the process of creation. And we want to extend that idea to the themes that have been coming up as part of this conference.
Yeah, I think something we've discussed a lot is what the words in the title of this conference mean. So co-creating the future. It might sound really self-explanatory, but what do we mean when we say co-creation? And that might, again, that sounds like a really obvious question, but I think everyone in this room will define it slightly differently, and will define it differently in different conversations. In a UK context, co-creation often is associated with participatory work, often work with young people and communities, and it refers to a really specific thing, which is making in a way that has a kind of flat power structure. Often it's shared agency, it's taking participants seriously as creative agents, rather than coming in as I am the artist, you are the participants, I will help you make art. It's thinking about us as a room. And that's a way that me and James often make. Both of us have a background as facilitators and as people making work with often young people and communities. And that's a really important part of our practice.
And what we've discussed is the political, philosophical motivation behind why we choose to make co-created work, which comes from a desire to democratize access to the arts, by which we mean arts spaces and arts funding, the material things that actually have an impact on people's lives when they have access to. And we are really interested in challenging the separation between the idea of artists who make art and the public who consume art, and find models through which we acknowledge that actually art is a fundamental part of all our lives, everything that we do, and all of our work, even work that isn't artistic. I was talking earlier in the week to another Manchester artist called Elmi Ali, who has been attending parts of the Congress, and he put it really eloquently. He told me that he was interested in not thinking about art and everything else, but placing art in everything else.
And I think with these conversations about access to arts comes really critical conversations about who is in the room. And by that, I don't just mean the rehearsal rooms, the rooms we're making work in, but rooms like this massive one, you know? It's being really honest and serious and critical about who is in the room right now. Me and James are, I think, amongst the youngest, unless any 18-year-olds want to make themselves known. 18? We're amongst the youngest at this Congress. We're in a minority of freelance artists. That is, in and of itself, neither a good nor a bad thing. I think there is absolutely value and use in having conversations largely with buildings and arts managers. I think that's really important. But I think it's being really, in the same way we're defining our terms, being really clear and definitive about who is in the room. And that also extends to the conversations that have been rightly brought up this week about Indigenous groups and the countries and states living with the legacy of Western colonialism. I think having these conversations and being really clear about who is in this room right now is really, really important. And I think with that, we get into things about when we talk about the next generation, who are we talking about? And that, again, sounds really blatantly obvious, but I think it's often used in different ways. Are we talking about the next generation who are currently associates in buildings, who are going to become artistic directors in the next 10 years? Are we talking about the artists of mine and James's cohort, who might be leaders and sort of moving into positions of leadership in 20 years? Are we talking about children? Are we talking about generations in hundreds, thousands of years' time? Again, none of these is wrong. I think it is just being really clear when we have these conversations who we mean situationally.
There's a park down the road from me. It's called Alexandra Park. If you're familiar with Manchester, you might know it. It's got lots and lots of trees of a certain age in it. They're between 150, 200 years old, and they're all quite large trees. And whenever there's a storm, one of them invariably either blows over or loses a huge bough and becomes terribly damaged. The problem with Alexandra Park is that the next oldest trees in that park are around 40 to 50 years old. And so there's going to be a point in the next 100 years where those older trees are all gone, and there is a significant gap in age, in, shall I say, experience of trees. And hopefully you can see the metaphor that I'm trying to put over here is that as arts leaders of a certain amount of experience and a certain amount of power within institutions, within the sector, what is being done to find that next generation of trees, to make sure that there isn't a gap in experience? Clodagh and I have talked a lot about there's a sort of anxiety among older, more experienced members of the arts sector that feel like they're being told to shove off and clear off and make space for other people. But the thing about these trees is that you look at them and they seem strong and powerful, but actually there's a fragility there because there isn't an ecology around them. And it's not about getting rid of those trees and putting new ones in. It's about having a model that encourages trees to leaders to come in to foster experience so that there isn't that gap of experience, so that if a leader has to leave suddenly, there isn't a sudden vacuum that has to be filled.
And I think that ultimately comes back to, and you might notice a running theme in what I'm saying, when we talk about the future, when are we talking about? Because I think we're very good at talking about the future of the next 6 months, and we're very good at talking about the future of the next 100 years, but we're less good at joining the dots between those two things. What do we do with all those little futures between now and, ambitiously, me and James running buildings? What does that look like, and how can we build in the ecology for that transition to happen? How can we think about the future not as a finite thing, a destination, but how can we think about that journey of futuring?
And I think it's important to bring it back to what Chloe mentioned earlier, to think about this provocation not just in the sense of a single organization, a single leader, but think about our role within organizations, within broader sectors, within the countries that we all operate in, within the states that we all operate within, and on a global arts context. How do we create an ecology that isn't about older, more established institutions shadowing over other institutions that can be given power and can be encouraged to be part of a global ecology, not just a local one within an organization or within a single state. We'd like to close out with a few questions, provocations for you to take away and hopefully reflect on how they fit within your practice, your perhaps institutional role, and the power that we all have to different extents.
Yeah, I think one really pertinent one is how are we all building sustainable ecologies of arts leadership?
And ask yourself, how are you creating space? How are you sharing the power that you have with the next generation?
And how do we co-create the future with equity, honesty, and a willingness to learn? Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have to remember some of those metaphors. They're a perfect way to tell us things. 2.5 years ago, we received a proposal from Manchester to host a Congress in 2023. At the time, we're in the middle of the pandemic. We wondered if we'd ever really gather again in person. Well, I'm delighted to say we're here. I'm also saddened that it's drawing to a close. We've worked with many terrific people and organizations in Manchester, including the team at the International Festival, as well as the Manchester City Council. However, our hosts at home, led by Dave Moultrie, have been exemplary and a real joy to work with. I particularly want to give a huge thanks and hug to Dave, Seki, Bonnie, and Nikki. You've been amazing, and I think we all feel like we're leaving friends as well as co-workers. Supplementing the team at home with invaluable production work has been ASP events. And again, I want to give a real shout out to Alexa, Kate, and Barbara, who've just been incredible in terms of supporting us, as well as A to V. So thank you. I also want to thank the front of house team and the production and technical crew here at Bridgewater Hall. You've treated us wonderfully, so thank you, and it's a beautiful place to have spent the past 3 days. So as I've said before, it takes a village to build a Congress. And I'd like to thank the funders and sponsors, including Arts Council England, Manchester City Council, Visit Britain, Greater Manchester Combined Authority, ARUP, and Charcoal Blue. Thank you so much for your support. Most of us in the room work with volunteers. They're an invaluable part of the infrastructure of our organizations. And the team here, the team at home, put together a really great group of volunteers. You've seen them in the red T-shirts. And I just want to acknowledge their support. It would have been a very rough week without them being here, so thank you. Finally, many of you have let me know what a great team I've got at ISPA. Well, you won't be surprised to know that I'm aware of that. Every day I have the joy of working with a really amazing group of people, and I really want to acknowledge Mara Driscoll, Rich Johnson, and Magda Mazurek. Thank you for your support, your initiative, and your tireless energy. So we're almost there. As much as I'd love to stay in Manchester, we're now moving on to 2024 and ISPA's 75th anniversary. Please join us in New York in January and then Perth, Australia, the last week of April. We have a lot planned for the 75th anniversary in terms of celebratory events. You may have noticed we've been doing some video interviews while we've been here. We're going to continue that at the closing reception. So please feel free to wander up and have an interview with us, just talking about your experience with ISPA. It doesn't take long, and everyone is welcome. I really want to thank the BSL interpreters who have been here all week with us. I don't know how you do it. Thank you. One more thing before we go. I want to thank everyone who's been supporting ISPA throughout this month and throughout this year. We're just 1,000 shy of our goal. The good news is New York's 5 hours behind, so you still have till midnight or so tonight to contribute before we flip into July. I also want to acknowledge the latest 2 donors, 2 fellows, Sui Boon from Singapore and Su Yin Su from Taiwan. Thank you so much. So please join us for the closing reception at Society. It's just out the main doors down the ramp, and you can't miss it. The reception's going from 2 to 4, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your stay in Manchester. And most of all, I want to thank you for being here. Resources are short, time is short, and we so much appreciate your being here. Thank you, everyone.